listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. We appreciate you joining us each and every week. Before we get to this week's guest, lots of stuff to get to here and some really cool information I'll share in a minute, but wanted to remind you guys of our partnership with Amazon. Really easy. Just go to our website, hazardground.com, click on the Amazon banner right in the middle of the homepage, do your normal Amazon shopping. You guys have heard me tell you about this for weeks now, and the reason we keep repeating it is because it's working. When you guys go to our website, hazardground.com, click on that Amazon banner and do your normal shopping, we get a percentage of what you spend, and then we take that money and donate it right back to some of the charities you've heard on the Hazard Ground. In fact, we've just made another donation to one of the charities called the Headstrong Project. This is a phenomenal organization that provides free mental health care to veterans. So whatever you guys are doing, whatever you're spending on Amazon through our website, it is working. You are helping out veterans from the comfort of your own home. You don't have to get up. You don't have to do anything extra. Just go do your normal Amazon shopping through hazardground.com and clicking on that Amazon banner, and you guys are making a difference. So thank you so much for that. Also, I want to remind you guys to make sure you get on iTunes, leave us a rating and a review. The reviews help us out so much, as do the ratings. It helps grow the podcast. But listen to this. Check this out. This is amazing. One of the reviews that we just got last week from a kid named Josh says, and I quote, "I listen to your podcast every day at work, and I've listened to some of them 3 or 4 times, and this podcast is one of the reasons I decided to go down to the recruiter, and I'm going to go into the Air Force." Wow. That is just unreal. We never expected anything like this to happen when we started this, but the fact that we are hearing that from people is the reason why we do this podcast, and it's the reason why people love it, is because of these stories that we're telling each and every week. And so thank you, Josh, for your choice to serve. Thank you for listening to the podcast, and certainly that is an amazing review, and we couldn't be prouder of you and the work that we're doing here at the Hazard Ground. So great news, great way to start this week's episode. Make sure you guys as well follow us on all the social media sites, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Hazard Ground Podcast. Keep up with what's going on with the show. I couldn't be happier about, I'm like just so excited. I couldn't be happier about that review in and of itself. And with that, let's get to a very special episode as we approach Memorial Day, a very special episode with a very special guest. Joining us this week as once again, we touch the outside part of military members and their family lives. We have another Gold Star family member here. The story is of Major Sam Griffith, a Marine Corps major who was killed in the Helmand province in Afghanistan on December 14th, 2011. His sister wrote a book called Always My Hero, and she joins us now. Her name is Renee Nickell on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Renee, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, look, obviously we appreciate it because, you know, it's such a tough thing for you to discuss and such a tough set of memories for you to relive. So we certainly appreciate you opening up to us. And we've interviewed Gold Star family members before. And, you know, I don't know how to start other than say I'm sorry. You know, obviously nothing will ever replace the loss of your brother, but it certainly is, you know, it's commendable for you to be willing to keep his memory alive and keep his spirit alive and share his story. So we thank you for that. But let's start kind of back at the beginning. We ask about, you know, we usually ask about the individual and how they got into the military. But, you know, for your brother, he actually, you know, was a fairly normal guy from my studying and, you know, went to college and ended up joining the Marine Corps after college, correct?
He actually switched from the Navy ROTC into the Marine Corps ROTC when he was at Penn State. So he was offered a full scholarship into the Marines. So, you know, he could still, you know, his dream was to fly F-18s and he could still do that by switching from the Navy to the Marine Corps.
When did you know, like, he wanted to go into the military? Was it something he always wanted to do?
Oh, yeah. He wanted to fly jets since he was about 5 years old. So, I mean, that was the one and only goal his entire life. And so everything he did was always working towards that. And I don't know if you remember the movie Space Camp, like back in the 80s.
Yes.
So my brother was obsessed with that movie, and you know, he wanted to go to space camp, and you know, so we were thinking, well, maybe one day he'll become an astronaut, you know, and he just wanted to fly. So he just, he was really smart and motivated and just really worked hard to obtain that goal. So, we always knew he would go into the military. We actually thought that he would go into the Air Force. That was his plan. And then, and then when he was choosing colleges, he knew he wanted to go to Penn State because, a lot of our family went there. And so he ended up going into the Navy ROTC and then switching over to the Marine Corps.
Now, when he made this decision, this was pre 9/11, so the world
Correct.
was dramatically different. I like Sam, signed up prior to 9/11, and I can remember, I've told this story often, that, when I was going through my senior year of college, I was an ROTC cadet, and there was job fairs and everything else going around, and my fellow classmates would ask me, are you going to the job fairs? And I would say no, and they're like, why? I'm like, because I have to go into the Army after. And they literally would look at me and go, well, why don't you just get a real job? And so, because that's what the environment was prior to 9/11.
Yeah.
I mean, the military was downsizing. We were in a period of 20 years of peace since Vietnam.
Right.
And so, from that standpoint, it's one of those things where it was a questionable decision. What did you think as a family member that he wanted to do? Was there ever any concern?
No, I never had any concern about him. I mean, and I tell people, even up until he deployed his third deployment as a forward air controller, I never worried about him. I didn't see him. I saw him as an expert at what he did, and to me, he was just my invincible older brother. Because that's how he had always been my entire childhood, and he was just able to overcome, a lot of different trials and so I didn't worry about him. Now, I do remember, come 9/11, I remember that morning so vividly. I was in this little apartment with my husband and my 2-year-old daughter. And, my mom calls and she's like, turn on the TV. And so we turn on the news, of course, and we actually see the second plane fly into the World Trade Center. And I just remember my husband looking at me and he said, we're going to war. And I'm going to join the Air Force. And so, because, his mom and dad had both served in the Air Force and he had kind of been tossing it around. And I was just like, oh my gosh, we're going to join the military. And at that moment, I was so freaked out. I got my car, I ran over, I drove to my mom's house. We lived a couple miles away. And I remember walking up on her porch and her coming out of the house, and she was just sobbing, and she was like, I know Sam's going to war. And I was like, Gentry's joining the Air Force. He's going to join the military. And I just remember us just like holding each other and crying, because that's when the reality, of our world just struck us. And we realized that none of us are really invincible. This is happening. So
where were you geographically? I'm just curious.
I was in Jupiter, Florida.
Okay. All right. So
at the time, yeah.
All right. And so you have the double whammy now. I mean, your brother's already in the Marine Corps, and your husband says he wants to join.
Right.
Did you have any conversation with your husband, try to talk him out of it?
No. I was fully supportive. Actually, I had a conversation with my brother. He called me up and he really just kind of walked us through the process. And, and I was like, wow, I'm going to become a military wife. My husband's going to serve our country. And I just kind of had a sense of pride. I don't know. I mean, the fear of war was there. And my husband did eventually deploy to Afghanistan. But I don't know. There's just a sense of pride that comes along with, my brother serving our country, my husband joining, me being a military spouse. And then, I come from a long line of patriots who have served our country. So my father served, my stepdad served, my grandparents served, my in-laws, both his parents were officers in the Air Force. And so, we were just surrounded by military, and it was just a great sense of pride.
Do you remember the conversation you had with your brother and asked him, did you ask him, like, what's going on, Sam? Do you know where you're going? Do you know what's happening? Were you curious about anything?
Yeah, I was curious. When he went to Iraq the first time, because he was still training to fly. So it really wasn't until 2003 that he, got word that he was going to go to Kuwait. And he was just going for 3 months, and I remember him telling me, Renee, I'm in the air. You don't need to worry about me. And he said, I'll be fine. He said, it's always, it's the guys on the ground that you need to worry about. So
did you believe that?
I did. I believed when he told me that. I believed that. And so when he deployed the second time to Iraq, he was on the ground. And I remember having a conversation with my dad in our kitchen. And, he was like, I'm really worried about Sam during this deployment. He's going to be on the ground this time. And, and I was thinking, Sam will be fine. I just, trusted that he would be okay. Even though I saw this fear, it was almost this panic that came over my dad's face. I'll never forget the look on his face when he went on that second deployment, but he came home safely. And then his third deployment, I don't know. I was just oblivious of how dangerous his job was.
Right.
And he never told me, he never told me.
You
how
never
dangerous
asked?
It was. I never asked. No.
Was it because you just were playing dumb, do you think, in retrospect? Was it naivete? Was it too scared to ask?
Well, Sam was kind of, he didn't like to overshare, especially in regards to his military career. So, there's a lot of people who wouldn't even know my brother was a pilot, unless they had asked him, specifically, what do you do? He didn't talk about his military career a whole lot in that regard. But, I noticed there was something about him because I actually spent a week with him before he deployed. And we were living in North Florida at the time, in the Panhandle, and we drove down to my mom's house in Jupiter because my brother served with the 4th Anglico unit in West Palm Beach. And so I just remember him always sitting on the porch, very quiet. He would just, I would look at him and he would look at me and he would just kind of give me a half smirk and an eyebrow raise. And I felt like I knew there was a lot on his mind, and I felt like I didn't want to add to it by, questioning him or causing any more stress in something that he may already have felt, stressed about.
Did your husband ever ask him? Did your dad? Did your mom? Did anybody ever ask him about what went on?
I learned some things, after when I wrote the book. That's when I really started talking to my mom and his buddies and friends and that sort of thing. My mom was very, very fearful, which she never told me, until after he died and I wrote this book. I think people don't want to
think
talk about
the
their concerns.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's just kind of, you have that fear, and it's whether you have it or not, you just, you can think it, but you don't really want to say it out loud.
It's weird. It just dawned on me. My brother nor my sister has never once asked me about a single day in either of my deployments. And I've been on 2 of them. My last one was in 2011. So, we're 8-9 years ago. Never once have they ever bothered to ask me a single question. And now when you say it, like you never asked them about it, I said, well, that seems weird that you would never ask. And then I thought about, now I feel like it seems weird that they never asked me, but I guess it's kind of normal.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like, what am I going to say? Sam, did you ever kill anybody?
I mean, that's always the place that's where kindergartners start. Like when I talk to small kids, it's the first question they ask. So I figured that's a decent jumping off point.
Exactly. And I remember growing up, my uncle, he served in Vietnam. And I remember my dad always telling me that talking about Vietnam was off limits. We were never allowed to discuss it with him. And so I grew up knowing that, if a person wants to talk about their time in war, they'll talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, we've interviewed other Vietnam vets, and we've interviewed kids of Vietnam vets who are in the military, and they said the same thing. My dad never talked about it. My uncle we never talked about it until they put on the uniform. And then their father, their uncle, whoever it was willing to open up and share stories because they understand. And I think Vietnam was a little bit different. The only reason I say that, Renee, and just give me a second here to expound on it. Clearly, the way we treat veterans and clearly the way we treat war is much different now than it was for Vietnam. And I can understand the angst of Vietnam vets not wanting to say anything for a lot of different reasons, a variety of different reasons that we've discussed multiple times here on the podcast. So not that I think that, one is bad or one is good. I'm not even going there. I'm just saying with the war on terror and everything in the post 9/11 world, I feel like we've been a lot more open about these discussions. I mean, heck, we're writing books and making movies about them on the regular, right? I mean, it's
right.
It's fairly commonplace discussion now.
Yeah, and when I was growing up as a kid, I had no idea how Vietnam veterans were treated.
Right, none of us did.
I was just told that my uncle went to war and we weren't allowed to bring it up or talk to him about it. So I just associated war or somebody going to war with, off-limit conversation. And so, I just figured if my brother wants to tell me what he did over in war, then he can come to me and he can tell me, but I'm not going to pry.
Do you wish, in retrospect, you had asked more questions?
I do. Yeah. I wish I would have.
Do you think in asking more questions, it would have made it harder for you to know that Sam was away and constantly in danger?
Possibly. Yeah.
Would it have made it harder that your husband also was going through the same thing?
Yeah. And when my husband, his name is Gentry, when he deployed to Afghanistan, he just always told me, hey, I'm on the base, I'm safe. I don't leave the compound. I don't go out, and so I never worried about him. But every once in a while, he will say something, and I know that there are things that he saw that affected him. I just think it's normal for our spouses and our brothers and our sisters and those who are fighting in war to not talk about it. They don't want us to worry. What good are we over here trying to take care of things on the home front if we're visualizing all the stories they told us.
No, yeah. I mean, I guess, again, that part would bother. Like, I felt the same way. I didn't want my family to worry. I never said anything to my mother. Now, my stepfather was in Vietnam. Every now and then, if I got him on the phone for 5-10 minutes, I'd kind of clue him in on a couple of things that were going on, some things, the nature of combat, because he understood it, because he was there.
Yeah.
So it was easy for me to tell him, and I knew he would be able to either, one, relay the information properly to my mother, or not tell her what she didn't need to know, but he was fully aware of what I was in because of being a Vietnam veteran. So, it's unfortunate because, again, you obviously you can't ask these questions. Do you know at this point in time, is there anything that you don't have an answer to that you want still about Sam and what he did and where he was and everything else?
No, because I have a great relationship with a lot of his Marines. Mm-hmm. Several are very close friends of mine now. We've had conversations, some of them were very open with me in writing the book. Several of them contributed to the story. Sergeant Winters, he was actually with Sam when he was shot and killed. He actually worked on him all the way back to base. And it's just, he edited that entire chapter for me. And
oh, really?
oh my gosh. And I'm thinking, I hated to even ask him. I just, when I sent him the chapter on basically just the information that I had is how it was written. And when I sent it to him, he did like just a total edit of that chapter. And now it's like, it's like having the full story from firsthand. Right. And I hadn't had that before.
I don't want to get too far ahead because I want to get to, I don't mean to cut you off. I want to get to this sort of chronologically so our listeners can follow. So I don't want you to tip your hand too much.
Sure.
But let's kind of go, back a little bit. So it was Sam's third deployment. He goes to Afghanistan. Now, at this point, have you become desensitized to the fact that he was going and coming and going and coming? Was it not a big deal anymore?
Oh, yeah. Well, every time I talked to him, he was training. So, I mean, he was always going, he was going to Morocco. He was going to, just different places to train. And so, yeah, I think I did become desensitized. I became desensitized because at this point when he deployed, I was a military spouse for 10 years at that point. And I was living amongst the military community. And so that was just kind of my world. And so when he called me, and told me that he's deploying to Afghanistan, I mean, the word Afghanistan, yeah, that scared me, but my husband had already gone. And so by the time Sam deployed in 2011, I already had gone to a deployment with my husband in 2000. When Sam deployed in 2011, my husband, he had gone in 2007. So I had already been through that deployment.
Let me ask a dumb question. And I know it's dumb when I ask it, or at least it sounds dumb in my head. Is there a difference in the fear from your husband to your brother when they're gone?
Absolutely.
What is it? How can you describe it?
Well, I mean, we had kids. When my husband deployed, we had 2 children. So, yeah, you think about how am I going to raise these kids by myself if something happens to him? It's just a different kind of fear because there's a different relationship. And, my brother, when he deployed, it was, he's a Marine with 4th Anglico. He's already flown F-18s. He's been there, done that. He's just going to go over there and kick butt. So, it was just totally different. And I didn't have the same fears that my mom and dad had. So when my mom called that morning and told me that he had been killed, I couldn't understand what she was saying on the phone. And so she's crying like hysterically. And I'm thinking in my head, something must have happened to Sam. He must have been injured and he's coming home, but at least he's coming home alive.
Oh, wow.
In that split moment, that's what I was thinking. And then she's like, your brother was killed in Afghanistan.
All right. Well, let's go through the events leading up to December 14th, 2011. Where was this in relation to when he got there? Was it the beginning, towards the middle, towards the end?
He was 5 weeks into the deployment.
Okay. 5 weeks in. Okay.
Yeah. Into a 8-month deployment. Right.
All right. So what do you know about the morning of December 14th?
I know that, he was the forward air controller. So he was the detachment officer in charge, Major. He was back at the base and he was viewing the live video screen of the, what's happening outside. And he's, watching his Marines and he's calling in air support. And he was watching his, one of his Marines in particular, Sergeant Jason Hartzell, was coming under heavy fire for, an extended period of time. My brother's thinking, wow, he must be really tired. He's got to be tired. I don't want him, under this heavy fire anymore. So when they came back into base, my brother was like, hey, you view the feed, the next shift, you view it, and I'm going to go out. And, that's just, that's rare for an officer to do, but
Sure, yeah.
he just wanted to take care of his guys. And, his mission before he even left American soil, his mission was to make sure that all of his Marines came home alive and safe. And so that's what I had it in my head. That's what I had in my head, is that Sam is being deployed to make sure that his guys come home safely. So obviously he knows what he's doing. So then he steps in for Jason Hartzell, and he goes out, and he was with Sergeant Winters, and they were, about 200 feet from the compound. And that's when bullets just began to rain down, and they dropped down behind a mound. And, they were also with the Royal Marines. They didn't have positive ID of where the enemy was coming from. And so my brother actually stood up to get positive ID. And so he was shot, and he wasn't able to crouch down and before, he was shot and killed. But in doing so, he ended up saving, his entire team. So who was out there that day.
Okay. Now, that's the official account that the military gave you, Department of Defense?
Yeah, Department of Defense and his, the guys who were with him.
Okay.
So he got the Bronze Star with Valor. He was awarded. So
your mother gets this phone call, or it comes to the house, I assume, right? Your parents get it first before you do? Actually,
well, yeah, my mom found out, but actually what happened was the timing was off when they went to, because they're supposed to knock on everybody's doors at the same time. And so my mom left for work.
Where was your mom at this point in time?
She was at her home in Jupiter, okay. And she worked about, an hour south in Boca Raton. And so she had gotten to work. She had already been to work about 30 minutes. And when she was on her way to work, she got 2 phone calls, and she didn't recognize the number. And she was like, who in the heck is calling me, at 8:00 in the morning? So she didn't answer the phone call. She went into her office. She's there, and she's getting settled in. And then my brother's wife had called my mom, and she was like, Mom, are you sitting down? And so, and she was crying when she told her, obviously. And that's how my mom found out. So things started to happen pretty quickly after that. My mom called me immediately. And
now go back. Why didn't you understand what was going on?
When she called me, or
when your mom called you, you said earlier that you just thought Sam was injured.
Yeah, because I couldn't understand what my mom was saying. She was just crying hysterically. And I was just like, Mom, I can't understand what you're saying. And so I'm thinking in my head, it's obviously about my brother. He was obviously injured, is what I'm thinking in my head. But I'm thinking, at least he's coming home, because, when you're injured, you get to come home. That's the logic I'm thinking in my head. And so then my mom, she slows down her words, and she's like, Renee, your brother was killed in Afghanistan. And I mean, just going back to that moment, I mean, your brain can't even truly comprehend what you're hearing. I mean, it's just a state of shock that you instantly enter. And I just remember dropping the phone, and I just remember screaming, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. And my 12-year-old daughter, she runs in, and I mean, later she told me, she heard me screaming, and I hadn't told her what happened, but later she told me she knew. She knew, and she heard me screaming that, her Uncle Sammy had been killed.
Where was your husband at this point?
He was on his way to work. And we were stationed at Eglin Air Force Base. And my daughter called him up and said, Daddy, Uncle Sammy was killed. And he said, okay, I'm on my way back to the house. So we turned around immediately. And then she just started calling people, my 12-year-old daughter.
So your husband gets back home. Clearly, again, he understands the nature of war and Afghanistan and everything else.
Yeah.
Not that he can provide any sort of comfort per se, but do you remember what he said to you?
Oh gosh, I don't remember. I don't remember a thing except people coming and going from my house, and them packing up my kids' clothes. Us trying to figure out a way to get to Dover. We had, the military will provide airfare for anyone who's listed on the casualty report. So, my parents were given airfare, to fly to Dover, and, of course, his wife and his sons. And so, I was just in oh my gosh, how are we going to get from Florida to Dover, Delaware to receive his remains at that point?
All right. Now, I don't remember our Gold Star mom telling us last time, because she was in California, and I think she just waited for the remains to come to her. Is that an option always to go to Dover?
Yeah.
To meet the remains?
It is. It is an option to go to Dover.
Did you want to do that, or were you more comfortable staying back?
No, I wanted to. Yeah, I've never been asked this question before. Yeah, sorry, I'm just.
No, take your time.
No. I wanted to be there when he came home. Yeah, so it wasn't even a question. It was, I wanted to be there when he touched that American soil again. And so, it was my husband and myself and our 3 kids at the time. My son was a year old, and we just piled in our minivan and drove to Delaware.
From Eglin Air Force Base?
Yep.
Oh, God, that's a long-ass drive.
Oh, yeah. I was awake for probably 48 hours straight. We had actually stopped halfway at a hotel, and I just remember I knew I was supposed to be sleeping, but I just remember sitting up in bed all night long, blank stare, not even knowing what to do. I couldn't sleep. And so once we left the hotel that morning, and we drove several hours, my husband was like, Renee, you've got to take something to help you sleep or something, just take a Benadryl or something just to get a few hours of sleep, because I was on adrenaline overload. I couldn't even sleep.
Did you end up taking anything or no?
I did. Yeah. And then I slept for a couple hours, and then I didn't know what else to do except write. And so I just started writing all of these attributes about my brother that I loved. And then I didn't know it at the time, but it ended up being his eulogy. And his best friend from college planned his entire funeral service. And, I just kind of flippantly gave this to him. And I was like, hey, I wrote this about Sam. And it wasn't until the morning of his funeral, actually, when I looked at the pamphlet, before the service, I'm looking to see who's doing the eulogy, and my name is on there. So, but, I was so out of it. He may have told me, and I don't even remember. But so, and I included the eulogy in the book.
When you get to Dover, describe the scene for me.
When we get to Dover, we arrive at this beautiful home, and it's at the Fisher House, and it's a place for military families to come at no cost to stay, and there was just people. I just remember there's just people everywhere, and you're being briefed on what's going to happen, and everybody's telling you what to do, and you're trying to.
Renee, is this the first time you physically see your parents?
This is the first time I saw my parents, yes.
Okay, so what was that encounter?
Just crying, hugging, crying. There was one moment where I was sitting with my dad and my mom, and we were just sitting in a corner of the house, and one of us said something funny, and there was just this moment of laughter, and we all just kind of paused, oh my gosh, my brother had been dead for 2 days, and we're sitting here and we had a moment of laughter. And I think there was a moment of feeling ashamed that had happened. And I remember just looking at my mom and dad, and I just said, how can this be Sammy? And, they just looked at each other, looked at me, and we all just, we just cried together because, it was just, how could it have been him? Because to me, he was everything. He was, invincible. So it was kind of in that moment where we were like, life is never going to be the same again.
As a parent, you have your kids there, and you're watching your parents go through the awful, most unnatural thing in the world of losing a child. Is that a doubly difficult moment for you as you're looking at your kids and now knowing your parents are missing one of theirs? I mean, just kind of take me through those emotions, because obviously it's different when you're a parent.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really hard because I knew the relationship my brother had with each of them. And so, his relationship with my dad was totally different than his relationship with my mom. But they were just so equally just wonderful. And I mean, obviously, you have a different relationship with your mom and dad.
Sure.
And so, my brother and my dad had plans for the future to open up a Mustang business, and that was kind of hitting the ground. And, my dad had dreams of retiring and doing this business with my brother. And, they just spent their entire lives like under the hood of a car. And, there's a lot of conversations that happen under a car, and, so they were very, very close. And, and my mom, I mean, they were divorced. So we grew up in two separate households. I mean, Sam and I grew up together in the same house, but we shared, time. And so, my brother just adored his mom, and, he told her all the secrets that he didn't want to tell my dad, and my mom was just very, she knew, that's my son, he's going to do stupid things, but, I'll just kind of talk some sense into it. I won't judge, but, they just had a really special relationship, and it was very, very difficult watching them, because you're thinking as a sibling, you're looking at them and you're like, I have to somehow try to process their grief and process my own at the same time.
Yeah.
And I know my parents are hurting, and I have no right to be hurting as badly as they are. So I'm just going to take my grief and I'm just going to push it back there, and I'll just get to it in a little while. And then a little while becomes 1 year, and then it becomes 2 years, and then you're just consumed with feeling guilty for grieving, because you shouldn't be grieving as much as your parents are, or maybe as much as the widow is, or the children.
Do you think if you weren't a parent and weren't married and didn't have a family, you would have reacted differently?
Possibly. But, I think I've talked to enough siblings who feel the same way, who have felt that, they just had to set their grief on a shelf because their parents, were hurting so badly. And, I can't really explain it. I can't explain the dynamics of what happens.
No, I guess as an objective outsider, I sit here and I wonder, did anybody ever say to you, Renee, it's okay for you to grieve and be did your husband say it's okay?
Oh, my husband did. Oh, absolutely.
Were you just not able to hear it? Didn't want to listen?
Probably both. I just, I'm a doer. So I felt like I always had to do something. So after, a month after my brother died, I started college, And I became a full-time college student with a 4.0. And then I started training for the Marine Corps 10K. I had never ran before, but in February of 2012, I started running because I was going to do the 10K. And so I just started doing things because I was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. So I should be doing something. And, you know, you just don't know what to do after when you're grieving. You don't know what it looks like. So yeah, it was really my husband, honestly, because he's the closest person to me, who was like, Renee, you know, it's okay, you know, to not have it all together.
Let's go back to that house you were in Dover. They're briefing you on what's going to happen. What does happen?
So, you know, I can't tell you the rank, can't tell you anything about this guy. I just know he was in uniform. And I know he approached us in the kitchen, and I was standing there with my dad and my mom, and you know, the little kids, they're, you know, I mean, it's a sad time for them, but they're like playing Xbox, and you know, my middle daughter, she was 5 at the time, and then my 12-year-old, and then my son was 1, and then, you know, Sam's kids were there, and they were 6 and 7, and so they're playing with toys in the playroom, and this guy comes in and he's like, you know, we need to talk about, you know, Sam's remains. They're going to be here pretty soon, and so there's something I have to tell you. And he's like, I need you to understand this. So, you know, pay attention to me. I need you to understand that this is going to be the worst thing that ever happens to you in your life. Like, what's about to happen in 30 minutes is going to be the worst thing that you ever experience in your life. I'm like, can you imagine being told that? You know, like,
I thought you were already there is what really kind of was
exactly.
my first thought. How could it get worse after this?
Correct. And he was right. You know, when you see that flag draped coffin come out the back of that C-17, that's a moment that, you know, you just never forget. And I can say that was certainly the hardest moment out of all the moments.
Is it because the finality becomes final?
Yeah, you know, people say that, you know, what happens when you actually see them. We didn't get a chance to see him. So, you know, there was that, you know, you're looking at this flag draped coffin and you're trying to picture him inside it. But your mind is also trying to picture it empty. You know, you're hoping he's not inside it. You're hoping they made a mistake. And, you know, your mind is just going 100 different places. But, you know, that's the moment where, you know, you're thinking, oh my God, you know, my brother's dead. And this is the last time he's ever going to be in our presence.
Wow. Did you request to actually open the coffin and see it? Or they told you couldn't?
It was highly recommended that we not view him because of where he was shot, and he was shot right through his face, and so it was the only place that he didn't have any cover, and so, you know, his wife made the decision to have him cremated, and so yeah, we never saw him.
That moment when you see the casket come out, the flag draped coffin, and where are they moving it to? Where are they taking it to? Do you know? Or
I just know that they put it on the back of an ambulance and it drove away, and they were going to do an autopsy, and you know, and then they would cremate him, and I was actually, we ended up because the length of time that it took, we actually had his memorial service, with just a picture. And then my husband and I and our kids stayed with his widow for about 3 weeks because we still had to get through Christmas.
Oh, yeah, God.
And
Jesus.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's like Christmas Eve and we're like, oh my gosh, we don't have any presents for our kids. And
ain't that a kick in the pants?
Yeah. So Toys for Tots shows up at our doorstep with toys for, I mean, there was probably over 100 toys that they brought in the house for the kids for Christmas. And now,
were you back in Florida for that or no?
No, we were in Virginia Beach. So that's where that's where him and his wife lived was Virginia Beach.
Yeah, okay.
So he was a reservist, so he would go down to his unit on the his drill weekends. But so we stayed in Virginia Beach for about 3 weeks, and so we were there when actually his two best friends brought him home in his urn, and just dressed in their dress blues. They were both Marines and showed up in a Mustang and brought him home to his wife. And then a year later, December 14, 2012, he was buried in Arlington.
Renee, there's so many tangential things going on here, from your story. His spouse, his wife, your parents, the kids, all the kids, not your kids, his nieces and nephews, but, his kids as well. Are you able to start having conversations or any questions being asked? Are you talking to each other about this? How are you in the early stages of this? How are you all getting by? How are you grieving together, if at all?
I told you earlier about, I felt like we had to do something. And then, about 4 months after my brother was killed, I just kind of crashed and burned. I was, I was very, very depressed and having suicidal thoughts and just not really knowing what to do with the pain and had contemplated suicide.
Let me pause right there. I'm just when you get to that point, you're not talking to your parents. You're not talking to his wife. This is all total shutdown mode.
It's shut down, and there's a lot of arguing going on.
With whom? How?
So, parents, everybody around me. I was just, everybody's angry.
Sure.
And not really. It's hard to explain depression to people who haven't experienced it.
Right.
But one of the biggest signs of PTSD is anger. And my daughter is a type 1 diabetic, and she went into the hospital at one point, and I remember just screaming at the doctor because he wasn't helping her the way I felt that he should. She was very, very sick. And I just stood there and I was just like screaming at this doctor, like, why aren't you helping my daughter? And you're wrong. Your tests are wrong. And she ended up being, she was very, very sick, and she did eventually get the help that she needed. But I was really just lashing out at everybody. I just didn't know how to process the grief. And my husband, it was really him who consulted with some of the people in his unit, and they kind of came to the house and did an intervention with me. And I was just kind of like, I was just like, what are you talking about? I thought I was just grieving. I thought everybody feels this way. And I didn't realize I wasn't handling things at all.
How is your husband watching all this unfold? What is he saying? What is he doing?
Well, in the midst of it, we're fighting too.
Sure.
And we haven't talked about that time a whole lot.
Do you need to?
I don't think so. Honestly, I think we've moved beyond it just because of the steps we took to get better. So we did a lot of, interactive therapy. Actually, I talk about this in the book. The best thing that we ever did was equine therapy, where we worked with horses. And that was the organization who helped us deals a lot with combat veterans and PTSD. And they have a very high success rate. And so my husband and myself and my oldest daughter, who's 12, who, also suffers from PTSD, we just all, benefited tremendously from that. So I don't really feel like I need to go back and discuss that time frame. Sure. Every once in a while, I will, we'll have maybe a brief conversation about something.
Dip a toe in the water, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Without going all the way in.
Right. What is your relationship like with your parents through these first 6 months to a year?
There was a lot of turmoil with my dad, but I don't really want to get into that. My mom, we went through a period of about 4 months of not talking because her and I got into, a huge argument. And so you're trying to deal with all of these external relationships and also deal with the grief or not deal with the grief, and also be a wife and be a mom and, pay the bills. So, there's all of these things happening at the same time. And, it's kind of like you don't really know which one you need to process first. Which one do I need to work on first? And it was really hard going 4 months without talking to my mom. But when I went through that with her, it was more of they must wish it had been me instead of my brother.
Whoa, say that again? You felt like your parents thought that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Because he was like the superstar of the family. I mean, and I don't mean
Renee.
that. Oh, I mean, that's real. I mean, there's a lot of siblings who feel that way. My brother is a war hero. He did all these amazing things in his life, and, he was just, so highly thought of. And I felt the same way about him. And so, but your mind goes there. Your mind wonders if somehow life would have been better if it had been me and not him. I don't feel that way now.
Well, thank God.
Yeah. But when you're in that first year, and you're watching your parents grieve, you wonder, would they be grieving the same way if it had been me?
Wow.
So
yeah. No, and listen, I my exclamation was more of not that you were wrong for feeling that way or anything.
Yeah.
Just exasperation at the depths of how much hurt you guys were going through.
Oh yeah.
And in fairness,
it's not talked about. Honestly, it's not talked about.
What is the depth of the whole thing, or?
Oh yeah.
Like still to this day?
Yeah, it's. Unless you're a part of a really great support group, with other grieving siblings, if siblings aren't in with other siblings, this subject is not being talked about. And you're not talking about these issues with your parents or your friends. I mean, it's, first of all, you feel like you're free. I mean, there's some friends who can't deal with the grief and they back off, but and then there's friends who, were with you from the beginning. And, but yeah, it's not something that you want to talk about. It's not a feeling that you really want to express. And so, there are some really great support groups out there. The Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, is a great program who helps the military families of fallen soldiers. So, unless you're plugged in with something like that, it's not talked about.
The natural inclination, let me rephrase that because I don't know if it's natural, but an inclination would be that there's a certain amount of this grief that would hopefully bring everybody together and make them tighter, not separate them apart. Or is any of your family at a point where you guys are drawing back closer to one another, realizing the depravity of life and what has happened, that you may need each other now more than ever?
Oh, well, I mean, my mom and I are closer than ever.
Okay. So you have rebounded.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
We do a lot of things. We try to go to as many events as we can. She's my biggest cheerleader. She's probably read my book 5 times. She keeps it on the coffee table, and she's always thumbing through it and reading old stories. And, she's just always telling me how proud, she is of me. And, and I don't think she's doing that to make me feel better. I think, it's just, I feel like we've really risen from the ashes. And, her and her husband do a memorial golf tournament every single year in memory of my brother down in Jupiter, Florida. And 100% of the proceeds go back to combat veterans. And I mean, they've risen over 6 figures for combat vets. And I think this June will be the 6th year. So, you find things that you can either come together on, or somehow, there's just relationships that never heal. But my husband and I are very close. I have a great relationship with my kids, and, I feel like I've gotten to a place in my life where, I'm proud of myself and where I am now, and, just how I can, just be raw and honest enough in my feelings that even if it's one person can say, oh my gosh, I felt the same way, I'm not alone. That makes it worth it.
When Uncle Sammy comes up from your kids, what's the topic? What do they say? What do you say?
My oldest daughter doesn't really like to talk about him very much.
Why?
She still struggles. That day was just very traumatic for her.
Sure. Yeah.
She loved him so much. I mean, she just thought of him as a second dad. And, she really kind of just stepped into a parent role that day. And then she had an emotionally absent mother for the next 2 years of her life.
Wow. Were your other kids too young? I think you said your youngest was 1 at the time, so he probably has no recollection.
He doesn't. He talks about them like he knows them, though.
Oh, really?
We talk about Uncle Sammy so much. Even I have a 3-year-old daughter now, and even she talks about Uncle Sammy, and she knows his picture. And, it's just so sweet to me that they talk about him as if they knew him. And because they do, they know him from us. And, my 5-year-old, she remembers quite a bit, and she loved him too. She struggled for many, many years. There would just be moments where she would just break down and start crying, and we wouldn't know why she's crying. We would just try talking to her and ask her why she's crying. And then she would mention, I miss Uncle Sammy. So, we've gone through a lot of growth together as a family. It's not pretty, what Gold Star families go through afterwards. But I'm so thankful that I have the support system that I have.
Is there anything that makes you angry still?
That he's not here. Let me
rephrase. Are there any triggers for you that
Oh,
get you
yeah.
angry? Like,
Oh my
what
gosh.
are they?
Okay. Here, let's talk about this. Memorial Day.
Yeah, okay.
Guys.
That's what I was I didn't want to go directly there because I didn't know if it did or I guess because, I mean, look, I feel sort of the same. Sometimes the civilian society overdoes it to a point where it's almost disingenuous.
Yes.
And so to that end, that's why I was asking if there was any triggers that kind of make you realize and go, yeah, you guys are doing this, but you don't really know what you think you know.
Yeah, there's all kinds of triggers that I don't even realize that I'm being triggered until I really think about the time of year. So, you know, I'll actually start getting subconsciously triggered in late August, the time that, you know, I spent my last week with him. I get triggered in Thanksgiving. You know, that's the day he called us last. And then, of course, you know, the weeks up until Christmas. And then the weeks before Memorial Day. And then his birthday is June 14th, which is also Flag Day.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I just start becoming a little more on edge, and then I actually will talk to my mom about it, and she'll be having the same exact triggers, and then we'll just be kind of like, oh, yeah, this is why, you know, we're having a difficult time right now. But yeah, the Memorial Day thing, I could go off on that subject. But it's just, and I don't mean to, you know, and I mean, like last year, it was last year or the year before, you know, my mom was with a group of friends and one of them wished her happy Memorial Day. And she was just like, are you serious? What is happy about Memorial Day? I just had this conversation with a friend, you know, and he was like, what, you know? And I mean, there's some insensitivity that happens. So, you know, you just got to have grace for people, honestly, and you just have to thank God that they don't know what you've been through.
Yeah, and hope that they never experience the same thing. I mean,
exactly.
Yeah, well, again, commercialism and you know, has kind of hijacked Memorial Day and Veterans Day and everything else, and to that end, it's a little frustrating to say the least, because somebody who's worn a uniform for nearly 20 years and knows people like you and your families and what the entire depth of what combat is and what it entails and the post, you know, the aftermath and all that, I get upset at it. So I could clearly understand why, you know, people in your position would as well. With that, tell me about the book, Always My Hero. What was the impetus for writing it? When did you get to a point where you knew you wanted to tackle this project?
Well, you know, I knew probably since my late 20s, I wanted to write a book. I always had that in the back of my head. And I would say it to my husband. I'll be like, one day I'm going to write a book. I didn't know what I was going to write it about until my brother died. And then I started, you know, thinking I'm going to write a book, but I didn't really know how I was going to organize the book. I didn't know, you know, how I wanted the book to be. And so in 2003, I started writing the book, and I wrote several thousand, I think between like 10 and 30,000 words that I eventually just completely deleted. I don't even have them anywhere on my hard drive. I just realized that I was still in a very, very angry place, and just didn't want to publish a disaster. So I put it on the shelf for about another 4 years. And it was the prompting of a good friend of mine, Amanda. Her husband, she's a military wife as well. Her husband's an Army Ranger. And, you know, we were driving in the car, and she was like, you know, Renee, when are you going to write that book that you've talked about? And that was in 2017. And I was just like, you know, I think I'm ready to do this. And so I didn't know the first thing about really writing a book that would be published. But once the, you know, that creativity started to flow, it just really fell together beautifully. I knew I wanted to write a book that people could envision in their head as a movie. So I wanted them, as they read through the book, I wanted them to be able to visualize this, as a movie, so they could really feel who my brother was. And I was successful at doing that. People have just written me and they've told me that they just feel like they know Sam after reading the book. And that was the goal. I wanted people to really, really know and love Sam the way we did. So I had it written in about 3 months, and I got a publisher, and we published it. It was released July 4th of 2018, and I went on Fox and Friends. And then sales kind of slowed down. And then, we wanted in January of this year, I actually was offered a contract with a great PR firm. They loved the book, and they were like, "Hey, let's relaunch this book." And I was like, how do you do that? And they were like, well, let's get it republished, and we'll add a forward. And so I contacted Lieutenant Colonel Alan West, and within 24 hours, he had emailed me a forward. He was like, I would love this opportunity. So he was actually the congressman of the district in which my brother served, and he knew my brother. And so he was sworn in the year that my brother was killed. And so, it was really special that he wrote the forward. And so here we are. I've got a second edition now that's going to be released on his birthday, June 14th. And, with a forward by Alan West. And now I've got some great endorsements, and I'm so excited.
How much relief from grief does the book give you?
It comes in waves, but there's so much victory in this. And I mean, I have to tell you, it's a lot of hard work, and there's a lot of days that my husband gets texts from me that I say I want to quit. And, it becomes overwhelming. But you push through it. I think about that Marine who, I don't know recently if you saw him in the news, but his legs gave out at the Boston Marathon.
Yep. Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, and he just crawled across the finish line because he thought about, his 3 buddies who were killed. And and that's what it's like. It's knowing you're doing something for a purpose bigger and beyond yourself. And it helps. I know Sam is with me. I know therethere's moments of just utter and complete joy, and he's there with me in those moments. And then in the times where it's really, really hard to do, another interview and talk about it again, he's there too. And he's, just pushes me. So it does help. And it helps, all the feedback I get from other people who have said, your book has helped me. So
as you go through, these tours and the book keeps getting promoted, I know you say sometimes it gets tougher, but does it ever get easier?
I don't know if it ever gets easier. Every day is different. It just, I don't know if I'd want it to be easy. I know that may sound crazy, but
no, I think it makes sense, because if it gets easier, then it's almost like Sam is slipping from you.
Yeah. And I don't know, there's just, a deep satisfaction that comes with, overcoming, the hard times. And, it's, I don't know. it's good.
Renee, what would you say to any Gold Star family member listening right now?
Oh boy. I would say, depending on where they are on their journey, new Gold Star families, I would say take any expectations off yourself and other family members. It takes all of your energy just to survive that loss. And so you can't really look for any answers during that new phase, during that, first year of shock, and the second year when it becomes reality and you're coming out of the fog and, you're just really having to face the hard stuff. But, I'm a strong believer in God, and I have a very strong Christian faith, and that has come through, my walk, my healing process. And I would just say that there is always hope. You can feel happiness and joy again. You can enjoy your life, and you can be sad and you can grieve at the same time that, you're living. The joy and the grief coexist, and they always will forever. And so, what I wish somebody had told me after Sam died is how different the second year is from the first. And I wasn't really prepared, but hold on to your friendships, the ones who are real, keep them close, and, be willing to let go of changing relationships, I would say, because everything changes.
Well, I think they're incredibly sound words. I would add, from an outsider's perspective, courage and grace are two attributes that you have exhibited throughout this whole thing. Not only courage to tell your story, but the grace to be able to do it, not only with dignity, but also just to understand that people don't understand what you're going through, and allow for questions and meet a probe and just try to understand the human condition of this whole thing, and you being able to do it with a certain amount of strength and not be, upset for questions that may, unknowingly upset you, because it just, as we talked about, is a trigger, or it strikes a nerve about something you're feeling about your brother. So I thank you for that. And I certainly thank you for sharing your story and being courageous enough to do so. And I thank you mostly for keeping Sam's memory alive, because that is probably most paramount in all this. Whenever we talk to Gold Star families, is that for me, Sam is part of my life now. I didn't know him before this story, and now I do.
Wow, thank you.
And to that end, I think that's maybe one of the most important things that we can leave the listeners with, is that they'll know the name Sam Griffith, and that there's value in that.
Thank you so much. And I just got to say, thank you for asking the hard questions. I know, as an interviewer, it's got to be hard to ask those questions. And I truly appreciate that, because it's really the hard questions that, that help other people. It's great to hear Sam's story, and it's great to hear his life as a Marine, and just kind of getting through the surface questions, are always good, but it's really the hard questions that, the listeners who are going through difficult times can hold on to.
Well, I thank you for that. And I think the point more than anything, and part of the reason you wrote the book is to get to those raw emotions, is to get through the surface stuff. Sure, we can ask you how you're doing, and you can tell us you're fine and put a smile on your face and go about your business. But I think in the grand scheme of things, if we want to make an impact on lives and make an impact on people who are listening, it is those questions that allow them to really understand what you're going through. And that's why I use the word grace, because those questions are difficult for you, and I know that. And you could easily just said, look, I don't want to go there, and I'm not going to talk about that because it's too personal, and that's fine. I would respect that. But I think in the same respect, our audience is grateful that you're willing to be so honest and share with us all of your deepest feelings about everything that's gone on in your life. And again, I think it's a tribute to Sam. I think that Sam would want you to be the same way and help his story live on through those eyes.
Thank you.
Renee Nickell, thanks for being part of the Hazard Ground.
Thanks so much.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.